Every dictatorship in history understood that the most effective way to control a population is to control what children are taught. You do not need soldiers on every corner if you can shape what an entire generation believes before they are old enough to question it. The textbook is quieter than a gun, but over time, it is far more powerful. Most Americans assume propaganda is something that happens somewhere else. Russia rewrites its history books. China censors its classrooms. North Korea teaches children that their leader is a god. Americans look at that and feel grateful they live in a country where education is free, open, and based on facts, but what if it is not? What if the American education system does not teach facts? What if it teaches a carefully constructed version of history that makes the country look heroic, its wars look justified, its founding look noble, and its systems look fair? What if the most effective propaganda in the world is not the kind that is forced on you by a dictator, but the kind that is handed to you by a teacher you trust in a classroom you feel safe in before you are old enough to know the difference? Here are 7 things Americans were taught in school that are actually propaganda. Number 1. Christopher Columbus discovered America. This is probably the most widely taught lie in American education. Every American child learns some version of the story. In 1492, Christopher Columbus sailed the ocean blue, discovered America, and proved the Earth was round while everyone else thought it was flat. Almost none of that is true. Columbus did not discover America. There were already tens of millions of people living there. Thriving civilizations with cities, agriculture, trade networks, legal systems, and cultures had existed for thousands of years. You cannot discover a place where millions of people already live. That is not discovery. That is arrival. Framing it as discovery erases the existence of the people who were already there, and that erasure is the point of the propaganda. Columbus also did not prove the Earth was round. Educated Europeans already knew the Earth was round. The ancient Greeks had calculated the Earth's circumference with remarkable accuracy over 1,700 years before Columbus was born. That myth was invented in the 19th century to make Columbus seem more heroic and intellectually brave than he actually was. What Columbus actually did was land in the Caribbean, enslave the indigenous Taino people, institute a brutal system of forced labor, mutilation, and execution, and set off a chain of events that led to the deaths of millions of indigenous people across the Americas through violence, forced labor, and European diseases. Spanish records from the time document Columbus ordering the hands of Taino workers cut off if they failed to meet gold mining quotas. His men used indigenous people as target practice. Within decades of his arrival, the Taino population was nearly wiped out. This is not disputed history. This is recorded in Spanish colonial documents. And yet American schools teach children to celebrate this man with a federal holiday and a heroic origin story. The reason is simple. If America's origin story begins with genocide, the country looks very different. So the story was rewritten. The genocide became discovery. The enslaver became an explorer. And the victims disappeared from the narrative entirely. Number 2. The Civil War was about states' rights. This is one of the most persistent and deliberate pieces of propaganda in American education. Millions of Americans were taught that the Civil War was primarily about states' rights, with slavery being a secondary or even minor factor. This framing is so widespread that polls consistently show a significant percentage of Americans believe it. It is a lie, and not a subtle one. The states that seceded told the world exactly why they were leaving. Mississippi's Declaration of Secession says in its second sentence that its position is thoroughly identified with the institution of slavery, the greatest material interest of the world. Texas's declaration specifically condemned the federal government for promoting the debasing doctrine of equality of all men, irrespective of race or color. South Carolina's declaration repeatedly cites the federal government's failure to enforce the Fugitive Slave Act. Confederate Vice President Alexander Stephens gave a speech in 1861 in which he stated plainly that the Confederacy's foundations are laid, and its cornerstone rests upon the great truth that the Negro is not equal to the white man, and that slavery and subordination to the superior race is his natural and normal condition. The people who started the war told everyone it was about slavery. The states' rights myth was manufactured after the war during a propaganda campaign called the Lost Cause, designed to reframe the Confederacy as a noble fight for freedom and self-governance, rather than what it actually was: a war to preserve the right to own human beings. This revisionist history was then embedded into textbooks, particularly in the South, and taught to generations of children as fact. The states' rights framing doesn't just distort history, it sanitizes one of the greatest moral crimes in American history and makes it palatable for people who might otherwise have to confront what their ancestors actually fought for. Number 3. The atomic bombs were necessary to end World War II. Every American student learns the same story. Japan would not surrender. An invasion of the Japanese mainland would have cost hundreds of thousands of American lives. Dropping the atomic bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki was a difficult but necessary decision that saved more lives than it took. Case closed. The reality is far more complicated and far less heroic. By the summer of 1945, Japan was already militarily defeated. Its navy was destroyed. Its air force was nearly gone. Its cities were being firebombed nightly. Its supply lines were cut. Multiple members of Japan's leadership were already seeking surrender through diplomatic channels, particularly through the Soviet Union. The primary sticking point was whether the emperor would be allowed to remain as a figurehead, a condition the United States ultimately granted after the bombs were dropped anyway. Dwight Eisenhower, the supreme Allied commander in Europe, later wrote that he voiced his grave misgivings about dropping the bombs, stating that Japan was already defeated and that dropping them was completely unnecessary. Admiral William Leahy, the highest-ranking military officer in the United States at the time, and Chief of Staff to the President, wrote that the use of the bombs at Hiroshima and Nagasaki was of no material assistance in the war against Japan. General Douglas MacArthur, who oversaw the Pacific Theater, privately stated that the bombs were unnecessary. Many historians now argue that the bombs were dropped not primarily to end the war with Japan, but as a demonstration of power aimed at the Soviet Union. The Cold War was already taking shape, and the United States wanted to show the world, and specifically Stalin, what it was capable of. Over 200,000 civilians, mostly women, children, and elderly people who had no role in Japan's military decisions, were killed. They were not killed because it was the only way to end the war, but because it was the most dramatic way. American schools do not teach that debate. They teach the simplified version, where the bombs were unfortunate, but necessary. Because the alternative, admitting that the United States may have vaporized 2 cities full of civilians for geopolitical leverage, does not fit the hero narrative. If this challenges what you were taught and makes you think for yourself, subscribe to this channel now, turn on notifications, and leave a comment telling me which of these 7 shocked you the most. That engagement is how we keep making content like this. Let's continue. Number 4. Thanksgiving was a friendly feast between Pilgrims and Native Americans. The Thanksgiving myth is one of the most carefully constructed pieces of propaganda in American culture. Children are taught that in 1621, the Pilgrims and the Wampanoag sat down together for a peaceful harvest meal, gave thanks, and established a tradition of friendship and gratitude. The reality is that within a generation of that meal, the colonists were systematically destroying the Wampanoag and nearly every other indigenous nation they encountered. King Philip's War in 1675 resulted in the near-total destruction of the Wampanoag people. The leader of the Wampanoag, Metacom, who the English called King Philip, was killed, his body dismembered, and his head was displayed on a pike in Plymouth Colony for over 20 years. The Thanksgiving myth does not exist to teach history. It exists to sanitize colonization. It transforms a story of invasion, displacement, and genocide into a story of cooperation and gratitude. It teaches children that the colonizers and the colonized were friends, which makes everything that came afterward easier to ignore. Number 5. America fights wars to spread freedom and democracy. This is arguably the most dangerous piece of propaganda in American education because it is not just about the past. It shapes how Americans understand every military action their country takes in the present. American schools teach that the United States enters wars to defend freedom, liberate the oppressed, and spread democracy around the world. And sometimes that framing contains elements of truth. But the full historical record tells a very different story. During the Cold War, the United States overthrew democratically elected governments in Iran, Guatemala, Chile, the Congo, Brazil, and Indonesia, among others. Not because those governments were threats to freedom, because they threatened American corporate or geopolitical interests. Iran's Mossadegh nationalized oil. Guatemala's Arbenz reformed land ownership in ways that threatened the United Fruit Company. Chile's Allende was a socialist. In each case, the democratically elected leader was removed and replaced with a dictator who was friendlier to American business interests. Thousands were tortured and killed under those dictatorships. The Vietnam War was sold as a fight against communist expansion. Over 58,000 Americans and an estimated 2 to 3 million Vietnamese died. The Iraq War was sold on the claim that Saddam Hussein had weapons of mass destruction. He did not. The weapons were never found because they did not exist. Hundreds of thousands of Iraqis died. Thousands of American soldiers died. And the region was destabilized in ways that created the conditions for the rise of ISIS. Schools teach the heroic version. They teach D-Day and the liberation of Europe. They do not teach Operation Condor, the CIA-backed campaign of political repression, assassination, and torture across South America. They teach freedom. They do not teach the School of the Americas, where the U.S. military trained Latin American officers in interrogation techniques that were then used to torture and murder civilians. The simplest way to manufacture consent for the next war is to make sure the population was never taught the truth about the last one. Number 6. The Founding Fathers were champions of liberty and equality. American schools teach the founding of the United States as a triumph of Enlightenment ideals. Brave men who risked everything to establish a nation built on the radical proposition that all men are created equal. Those same men owned human beings. Thomas Jefferson, who penned the Declaration of Independence, enslaved over 600 people during his lifetime. George Washington enslaved over 300. James Madison, the architect of the Constitution, enslaved over 100. They wrote eloquently about freedom while profiting from a system that denied freedom to millions. The Constitution itself counted enslaved people as 3/5 of a person, not to benefit those people, but to give slave states more political power in Congress. Women could not vote. Indigenous people were excluded entirely. Poor white men without property could not vote in many states. The equality the founders championed was equality for wealthy white male landowners. Everyone else was excluded by design. This does not mean the founding ideals have no value. It means the founders did not live up to them. There is a difference between teaching that truth and teaching the sanitized version, where these men are presented as flawless heroes whose vision was fully realized at the founding. The sanitized version prevents Americans from understanding that the country's history is a continuous struggle to extend rights to people who were originally excluded. not a finished project that was completed in 1776. Number 7. The American economic system is the fairest in the world. American schools teach capitalism as the natural and superior economic system. The free market rewards hard work. Competition drives innovation. Anyone can succeed. The alternative is communism, which is evil, authoritarian, and leads to breadlines and gulags. What they do not teach is that American capitalism has never been a purely free market. The government subsidizes massive industries. Oil companies receive billions in subsidies. Agricultural corporations receive billions more. Banks were bailed out with taxpayer money in 2008, while millions of ordinary Americans lost their homes. The system socializes losses and privatizes profits. When corporations fail, the public pays. When corporations succeed, the executives profit. They also do not teach that the period of greatest American prosperity, the 1950s and the 1960s, that every politician romanticizes, featured a top marginal tax rate of over 90%. Strong labor unions, heavy government investment in infrastructure and education, and economic policies that would be called socialist by today's standards. The very era that Americans are taught to idolize as proof that capitalism works was built on policies that modern American politics has systematically dismantled. And they do not teach that dozens of thriving democracies use mixed economies that combine free markets with strong social safety nets and consistently outperform the United States on measures of healthcare, education, happiness, social mobility, and life expectancy. The binary of capitalism versus communism that American schools teach is itself Cold War propaganda, designed to prevent Americans from asking whether there might be a better version of capitalism than the one they currently live inside. 7 things. Columbus as the discoverer, the Civil War was about states' rights, the bombs were necessary, Thanksgiving was friendship, America fights for freedom, the founders were champions of equality, and the economy is fair. None of these are true. All of them are still being taught. And all of them serve the same function: to create a citizen who believes their country is inherently good, its wars are always justified, its systems are fundamentally fair, and its history is something to be proud of without qualification. That is not education. That is programming. The first step to thinking freely is recognizing which of your beliefs were chosen by you and which ones were installed before you were old enough to choose. Thank you for watching. If this video made you question something you were taught as a child, that is not a threat. That is what education was supposed to do in the first place. If you want more content that challenges the stories we are told to accept without evidence, subscribe to this channel, hit the bell, and share this with someone who needs to hear it. We will see you in the next one. Reason over rituals, always.